breaking the seal. In the echoing silence of the cavernous expanse, Edward and Thomas stood, their eyes fixated on the ancient murals that adorned the walls of the cave. What was before them would forever change their lives after this point. The yellow light from their headlamps illuminated the primitive wall art, revealing images of early hominids bowing in reverence before colossal, serpent-like entities. The images were ancient but remarkably well intact and preserved. Above the scene, a meticulously depicted night sky bristled with constellations. The stars, however, were unfamiliar, their odd arrangements and alien configurations contradicting known celestial patterns. Other objects were scrolled into the sky. He couldn't tell their significance. Edward, his fingers meticulously tracing the outlines of the painted stars, broke the silence. "This is the third such sight in as many months, Thomas," he said, his voice echoing off the cave walls. "And not just us. Reports from other privately funded research teams across the globe are trickling in, each one mirroring the same strange narrative. Sarah just called me this morning. She said she's going to retire after this one." Thomas, his gaze locked on the serpent gods, nodded pensively. "She should. We'd all be better for it. That woman is relentless, I'll tell you what." "Oh, and indeed this is more than strange, Edward. It's unprecedented. Not just the frequency, but the identical nature of these discoveries. It's almost as if..." He trailed off, lost in thought before finally voicing his conclusion. "It's as though something wants us to find these, to piece together a puzzle we don't yet understand. I have a feeling we haven't even got on the corner pieces." Edward turned to look at him. "And if there's any grain of truth in these murals," he said, gesturing to the human-like figures worshipping the serpentine gods, "we're dealing with a history that's far removed from the one we thought we knew. These don't belong to any known culture. We're going to have a harder time figuring out what drew them than what they mean. We finally found some answers, and I got more questions." Thomas nodded solemnly, his gaze returning to the ancient wall art. "We must tread carefully, Edward. We're in unknown territory, and there's no telling what we might unearth. We also need to be sure we know who we can trust. If word of this gets out of this, it could botch the whole thing. Years of research and funding gone like that." The two men stood in silence, their minds wrestling with the implications of their find. The echoing quiet of the cave seemed to amplify the building excitement. As they took one last look at the serpent gods, they both wondered independently about their origins. Although they were great friends, they came from vastly different backgrounds. Edward had seen a UFO on his family farm as a youth, and the drive towards science has been growing ever since. He didn't like to share the experience, but often when inebriated he would recall and reflect with other drunken strangers. Edward has always been skeptical, ever once experiencing anything extraterrestrial or paranormal. But as a fellow scientist, he wasn't without his questions. He thought it was fascinating to no end that even with all the known functions of science, yet there are still mysteries to which there is no explanation. He took on that responsibility to bring closure to these thoughts and ideas. In high school, when other kids were committing petty crimes and chasing tail, his biggest offense was theft. He would spirit away books from the classroom and library. Not just any books, but any literature, news article, or magazine on his coveted subject. He wasn't very popular, so sometimes those books acted as an escape to life's torments. Like Thomas, his luck with the girls was mediocre at best. Neither one of them were virgins by any means, but their pursuits have always been of a more quizzical nature. Their sacrifices have always been in the name of history or science. They were standing at the precipice of a new understanding of human history, one that was as unsettling as it was tantalizing. At night end there wasn't a single sound on the camp, only sentries stood watch overnight. Edward and Thomas, each engrossed in their respective data, were deep within the bowels of their lab. The room was filled with the hum of high-tech equipment and the rustle of classified documents. Amid the chaos of the lab, a peculiar pattern was starting to emerge. Both men, hunched over their desks, were cross-referencing their findings on a world map, and the more they compared, the more the dots seemed to connect. "Your data is weird as mine?" Edward said. "It doesn't make sense, Thomas. These artifacts are from different continents, different eras, different archaeological efforts. Yet they share uncanny similarities," Edward said, his eyes never leaving the screen. Thomas, studying a piece of pottery for the umpteenth time, nodded. It's as if they're all pieces of the same puzzle, spread across time and space. I hate to admit it, but it seems like all those alien shows were onto something. Yet, another mystery that is unprecedented, but the question is, what picture is this puzzle trying to form? As they delved deeper into their conundrum, a sharp knock sounded through the lab. Both men looked startled, their eyes meeting in mutual surprise. This late into the night, their lab was a sanctuary, closed to the world outside. Who could be knocking at this hour? With a glance at Edward, Thomas rose and walked cautiously towards the door. Through the small window, he saw a figure in a slick black suit. His heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary visitor. It looks like some kind of official. It didn't take them long to send the damn suits. Thomas shrugged. Fuck, let's hear what they have to say, I guess. Opening the door, they were met with a stern face, a crisp suit, and the unmistakable glint of a government badge. Good evening, gentlemen. I don't mean to startle you or intrude, and I'm not here in any hostile fashion. My name is Agent Smith. I'm here on behalf of the United States government, he announced, his voice as sharp as his attire. Edward and Thomas exchanged glances, their apprehension palpable. Was their research, their life's work, under threat? We've worked tirelessly for almost a decade, investing millions into this research, Edward protested, his voice thick with defiance. What gives the government the right to just waltz in and take over? Agent Smith raised a placating hand, his face impassive. Gentlemen, I understand your concerns. But I assure you, this isn't a hostile takeover. The government values scientific discovery as much as you do. We want to collaborate, not confiscate. You will be compensated for all your contributions. 2 days and $10 million later, they found themselves in agreement and packing up their research. The convoy of black trucks rolled out in an impressive parade, shimmering under the bright afternoon sun. As the vehicles began to move, the sight was both surreal and intimidating. Edward and Thomas sat in the back of one of the trucks. Their faces showed their apprehension and curiosity. The cold, firm seats of the truck did little to comfort them. They clutched their briefcases, filled with the fruits of their research, resting on their laps. They shared a glance, their eyes communicating more than words ever could. The unsettling feeling of an impending doom lingered in the air. The journey was a 2-hour ride through the vast desert landscape of Arizona. The barren and desolate scenery added to the unease. Their only companions were the sounds of the engine's hum and the occasional chatter of the radio. The convoy moved with a military precision, stirring up a cloud of dust in its wake. The scorching sun set, and the only light sources became the headlights of the convoy and the artificial lights that illuminated the mysterious facility they were approaching. It was an island of light in an ocean of shadows and secrecy. The place exuded a feeling of loneliness. The plain design wasn't anything to look at either. Scuffed metal walls with cylindrical portholes, the only features on them besides numbers above each door. Edward turned to Thomas. Well, at least I don't think they're going to shoot us in the desert anymore. They wouldn't have gone through all the trouble to bring us here. I hope. As they disembarked from the trucks, the cold desert night air hit them. They looked around, their eyes adjusting to the contrast of the brilliantly lit facility against the surrounding darkness. The transition was almost nauseating. More trucks unloaded, revealing more civilians, people who looked more like academics than government officials. There was a collective sense of confusion building amongst all who were present. Yet the sight of familiar faces in a foreign environment brought a strange sense of comfort. They were not alone in this. They recognized more than a few of their fellow researchers they had traded notes with over the decades. They were ushered into a briefing room, a large, nondescript structure that was far removed from the desert outside. Inside, they were introduced to some of their colleagues and other researchers. The room was filled with a sense of familiarity and shared purpose. It was a strange reunion, a gathering of minds pulled from their usual environments and thrust into this enigmatic circumstance. As they exchanged cautious greetings, they realized that they all shared something in common. They were all researchers who had made significant discoveries that had somehow led them here. The realization was both comforting and disconcerting. They were pioneers on the edges of knowledge, treading uncertain paths, their discoveries leading them to this point of convergence. The silence inside the camouflage pavilion was palpable as the researchers settled into their seats. All eyes were focused on the front, where Agent Smith stood. He was an imposing figure, his stern face betraying no emotion. The artificial light cast an imposing shadow behind him, adding to the air of authority he exuded. "Ladies and gentlemen, and everything in between," he began, his voice echoing in the stillness. "We apologize for any inconvenience this has placed upon you. Please understand the significance of your research has prompted such hasty actions. You are all here because of the magnitude of your work. Your findings, your research, your discoveries, they have led to this moment." He paused, letting his words sink in. The researchers exchanged glances, a murmur rippling through the crowd. Edward and Thomas dropped their apprehension and their curiosity took over. The United States government, along with many other global superpowers, have kept a close eye on all data regarding extraterrestrial activity on Earth, Smith continued, his voice firm. "The time has now come to share some truths with you. We've tried our best to reveal some of this to the public. For national security purposes, some of this we had to water down. But what I offer you today is the unadulterated truth. Needless to say, this never leaves this encampment. Your vow to secrecy will allow you some freedoms with this information, depending on the results of this get-together. One lucky team of researchers will be able to claim the discovery for themselves. After we've done our part, of course, when all is said and done, we'll have NDAs for you." Smith went on, "We have abandoned our usual methods of secrecy. The relevance of your independent research is far beyond what we could have imagined. Yes, we are aware of extraterrestrial craft visiting Earth, and we even have possession of some of them. But the truth you all have uncovered independently is of much greater significance. Those details will be provided later. For now, all you need to know is there is much more work to be done." The room was silent as the magnitude of Smith's words sank in. The researchers sat, stunned, their minds racing to comprehend the magnitude of the revelation. For some of these men and women, this was a lifelong dream since childhood. Others were terrified of the prospect of life beyond our solar system. Their over-calculating minds delving into every compilation of scenarios, from invasion to probing. In an almost divine orchestration, your individual conclusions have led you to explore deeper into ancient ruins and archaeological sites, Smith said, his voice carrying a hint of awe. "You have discovered connections that we have failed to see. The past that we didn't even know existed, and with that being said, you've opened up branches to realities we never thought to prepare for." He stopped and looked around the room, his eyes meeting each of theirs. "You have unearthed a narrative that suggests there may be more to the story of our existence than we have been led to believe," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have provided the necessities at your individual workstations. See to it that you are there promptly. There's lots of work to do and we get hands-on tonight." The meeting and its procession, Edward and Thomas were escorted to their respective lab. True to his word, the station was stocked with computers, analysis equipment, detailed Earth surveys, and more equipment than their lab had in its entirety. The following 2 days were a flurry of activity. The researchers, armed with their notes, mapped out significant locations, cross-referencing historical records and their own research findings. Then came the descent. The excavation site led to a cavern deep beneath the Earth's surface. The air became colder, filled with the scent of damp earth and the heaviness of history. The walls of the cavern were covered with ancient murals, their colors faded, but the stories they told were as vibrant as ever. Edward and Thomas, their eyes trained from years of study, were the first to notice the eerie similarities between the wall art and their own research findings. The murals depicted the same serpentine humanoids they had encountered in their studies. This time, the human representation in the murals were different. Fear was etched on their faces, a clear depiction of enslavement by the ancient hybrids. The revelation sent a chill down their spines. Further into the cavern, they came across another mural. The image was that of a godlike figure, an anthropomorphic entity with dragon wings. But where its face should have been, deep scars marred the surface. It was clear evidence of vandalism, a deliberate act to obscure the entity's identity. The researchers were left to ponder who would want to erase such a crucial piece of the mural, and why. Agent Smith's voice echoed in the cavern, jolting them from their thoughts. "Begin with your examination. Look for anything useful," he instructed. The researchers scattered, their flashlights piercing the darkness, illuminating parts of the cavern as they began their work. The walls were a myriad of scenes and events. Some correspond with known events throughout history, but the stars were the most telling. In one such depiction, it shows a creature that resembled a blooming flower, placing things in the ground. In the next mural, the planted objects blossomed forth the serpent race. For what purpose was still unclear. Geological data says the cave they were in predates the Maya. Yet some of their glyphs were present in the wall art, as were Nordic characters. The whole thing was a dose of crazy neither were ready for. It challenged everything they'd ever known or assumed about science and history. Curiosity burned brightly in their eyes as they advanced through their protocols. Edward adjusted his glasses and pointed to a section of the mural above. "Look at this, Thomas. The stars and constellations are more meticulously painted here, but they don't match the modern ones we know. This is giving me the creep freaks. I can't lie, this shit is making me on edge." Thomas squinted up at the ceiling, his finger tracing the ancient depictions. "You're right, Edward. These patterns are intriguingly different. It's as if they had their own celestial map. Do you think, no, it's not possible?" Thomas gave him the look. Okay, it might be stupid, but hear me out. Do you think it's possible that our solar system wasn't always in its proper place? What else could explain the star maps? There's something Smith isn't telling us, old friend." As they continued to study the mural, Thomas gestured to a landscape depicted in the artwork. "See this mountain? It's identical to the one we found in the desert last year. I recognize this ridgeline." Edward chuckled, recalling their daring adventure. "Ah, the Great Desert Expedition. Deciphering that ancient script and discovering an underground treasure trove. Some of our finest work. Things just felt right back then, you know." Their eyes met, and they exchanged a knowing glance. They had come a long way since then, unearthing ancient secrets, braving treacherous terrain, and outsmarting rivals. But they had always suspected that they were being watched. Not only by their rivals, but over the years they understood the significance of their findings. And knew eventually someone from higher up would be knocking on their door. Thomas leaned closer to Edward, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Do you think Agent Smith is still tracking our every move? He seems on the up and up, but I can't help but to feel like he's waiting for something. I think it might be wise to get hip to what that is before shit hits the fan." Edward glanced around cautiously, making sure they were alone in the cave. "I wouldn't be surprised. He's been a thorn in our side since we got here. He's looking, act normal." Returning their attention to the mural, they scanned the intricate Arabic inscriptions accompanying the celestial artwork. Some of the symbols were puzzling, and they exchanged puzzled glances once more. "These inscriptions are scattered and confusing," Edward mused. "We might need to consult a language expert to decipher them. Don't laugh, but I think these were written out of sync in the timeline. However, look here." In the scene currently captivating the two men, they saw an orb beneath the hideous dragon-winged god. A few soft pads of a cloth to remove the dust and it became clear. The orb was earth, and the god was accompanied by other misshapen things. Their outlines were enough to draw fear from their core. A cold sweat broke over Edward's face, and Thomas clenched his sweaty hands. Thomas nodded, his curiosity piqued. "Agreed. We should also consult an expert in ancient astronomy. I have a feeling this mural has more to say." Trying to ignore the growing tension in his chest, he changed the batteries in his flashlight. Edward and Thomas threw themselves into their work with a fervor that bordered on obsession. For almost 2 days straight, they pored over the ancient murals, their eyes scanning each intricate detail, their eyes memorizing the faded lines and shapes. Their bodies were weary, but their minds were alive with the thrill of discovery. With the help of copious amounts of caffeine and the willpower of a dung battle, they pressed on, hours blending into each other. The figure of the god, its face marred by deep scars, became the focal point of their investigation. They meticulously studied the surrounding murals, piecing together the fragments of a lost narrative. The serpent humanoids were more than just creatures, they were worshippers. But who or what were they worshipping? That was the better question, the query that drove their every waking move. Hours turned into days as they delved deeper into the mysteries of the cavern. Photographs, sketches, and notes began to form an increasingly clear picture. The god was not of this world. It was an entity of immense power, revered by the serpent humanoids. But where did it come from? Where was it now? A breakthrough came in the form of an elaborate mural hidden in the depths of the cavern. It depicted a vast body of water, and therein lay the answer. The god the serpents worshipped resided in the Pacific Ocean. The realization was both exhilarating and daunting. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, revealing a picture far bigger and more incredible than they had ever imagined. At first, they were apprehensive about sharing the information with Smith. In the end, they knew there was nothing they could do on their own with this revelation. With their findings in hand, they approached Agent Smith. His stern exterior gave way to surprise as they relayed their discovery. "The entity, it's in the Pacific Ocean," Edward declared, his voice echoing in the cavern. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then, Agent Smith broke into a rare smile, his serious demeanor replaced by a hint of amusement. "Well," he said, "I guess we're going on a cruise." Edward, Thomas, and the contingent of soldiers finally arrived at the remote location in the middle of the ocean, the coordinates they had painstakingly deciphered from the esoteric markings in the cave. Agent Smith, a man of iron discipline and unwavering resolve, announced the schedule. "We dive in an hour. Prepare yourselves." The crew, confined to the tight quarters of the ship for nearly a month, were a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The sonar had detected a sprawling anomaly beneath the waves, right where Edward and Thomas predicted it to be. A 40-mile-long anomaly. The sheer enormity of it was enough to send a shiver down the spine of even the most hardened soldier. The scientists and soldiers set about preparing for the monumental task ahead. Their movements were methodical and precise, each action revealing a deep-seated focus that came with the gravity of their mission. This was a venture into the ancient, the alien, and potentially, the hostile. Edward and Thomas gathered their team around a table scattered with maps and sonar readings. They pointed out potential points of interest, discussed the materials they would likely encounter, and speculated on the possible dangers. "Look for anything that disrupts the natural geological pattern," Edward instructed. "We're not just looking for artifacts. We're looking for signs of inorganic constructs, any alteration of the environment that suggests intelligent design." Meanwhile, Agent Smith was delivering a similar speech to his soldiers. "Remember, we are walking into the unknown here," Smith reminded his troops. "Our primary task is to ensure the safety of the team and the retrieval of any significant discoveries. Be on guard for any signs of hostility. We don't know what we're going to encounter down there." As the briefings ended, the team members began to dress in their specialized deep-sea gear. The researchers donned their suits equipped with advanced scanning tools and specimen containers, while the soldiers strapped on armor, checked their weapons, and ensured their communication devices were functioning. The ship hummed with preparation, and the tension was nearly palpable. But beneath the anxiety, there was an undeniable sense of excitement. More so for Edward and Thomas, for they were living their lifelong dream. Barring any unfortunate circumstance, they would be the first to discover and relay the existence of alien life in the universe. Edward and Thomas peered out of the small portholes of the submersible as it steadily descended into the depths of the ocean. The vibrant signs of life in the distant reef provided a comforting sight initially. Colorful fish darted through the crystal-clear waters, weaving between coral formations like living brushstrokes on a mesmerizing canvas. Their excitement was infectious, and the two researchers engaged in an unspoken competition to identify and mark down the various species they observed. Each species was met with a gleeful smile and a quick notation in their logbooks. But as the submersible descended further, the water grew progressively darker, bringing the games to a close. The once lively reef gave way to an emptiness, and the cheerful banter between Edward and Thomas faded into silence. The weight of the unknown pressed upon them, and a sense of foreboding replaced their earlier joy. The change in atmosphere was accentuated by the presence of Agent Smith and his soldiers, who stood stoically, their faces devoid of any jovial expression. They were here on a different mission, one that required utmost seriousness and readiness for action. Their presence reminded Edward and Thomas of the true purpose of their descent. Alien, the word that was so taboo in their line of work. The idea of ancient aliens somehow influencing our world was laughed at. Now, it was their heading. After 2 hours of anticipation and tension, the submersible finally reached the ocean floor. The lights attached to its exterior illuminated the barren landscape, revealing a sight that both fascinated and perplexed the occupants within. As the bubbles and ocean floor debris cleared, the sight was incredible. Before them stood a cyclopean structure, clearly not a product of nature but of intelligent design. The structure was adorned with spikes that acted as spires, and winding columns of ebony stone. It emanated an aura of repugnance and vile existence, defying any logical explanation. It was maddening to watch the carvings spiraling up the ebony columns. Edward and Thomas stared in awe at the sight, their scientific curiosity rekindled by this enigmatic discovery. Agent Smith and his soldiers, on the other hand, remained focused and vigilant. As the submersible settled near the cyclopean structure, Edward, Thomas, and the rest of the team prepared themselves mentally and physically. Maneuvering around the gargantuan structure, they found a slope leading beneath it. The decision made itself, they plunged even deeper into the earth. Quickly it became obvious the tunneling was natural, but indications whether it was from erosion or water flow was lost on them. Before they could do any worthy analysis, they saw shimmering light above the submersible. As they ascended towards the surface into the hidden underwater cave. Inside the small vessel, Edward and Thomas, along with Agent Smith and his team of soldiers, held their breath in anticipation. The submersible gradually broke through the water's surface, revealing a breathtaking sight beyond their wildest expectations. As they emerged from the water, the researchers and the agents found themselves in a cavern bathed in an otherworldly light. The source of this radiant glow remained a mystery, for it seemed as if the very rocks encasing them emitted a soft, blue hue. The team exchanged astonished glances, their eyes wide with wonder. Thomas, unable to contain his curiosity, branched off from the group almost immediately. He moved cautiously, drawn towards something in the distance that beckoned him like a siren's call. Edward watched his friend's retreating figure, bewildered by what had caught Thomas's attention. Edward turned to Agent Smith, who looked equally puzzled by the inexplicable luminosity of the cavern. Shrugging, Edward gestured towards Thomas's direction and mouthed, "I'll go check on him." Agent Smith nodded, his expression tense, as if he sensed something unseen. He motioned for his soldiers to remain vigilant, their weapons at the ready, as Edward moved to catch up with Thomas. As he approached, he could see that Thomas was standing before an enormous stone disc, which seemed to serve as the centerpiece of the cavern. The surface of the disc was adorned with an elaborate symbol, intricately carved into the stone. The symbol glowed with a soft, pulsating light, mirroring the strange radiance of the cavern itself. "Thomas," Edward whispered, awestruck by the sight. "What have you found?" Thomas didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixated on the ancient symbol, captivated by its enigmatic beauty. "Edward, I can't explain it, but this symbol. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. It's ancient, yet it feels alive, as if it's trying to convey something to us." "I can hear it, Ed. I can hear them." "Hear what, buddy?" Edward joined Thomas, their eyes locked onto the mesmerizing symbol. The intricate patterns and unknown meaning of this ancient artifact overflowed their mind with questions. It was as if the cavern itself had drawn them here, to this very moment in time. Their reverence, however, was abruptly shattered by a sudden commotion behind them. The soldiers accompanying them had been reduced in number, 2 of them were now missing. Panic gripped the remaining soldiers as they scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of their vanished comrades. Flashlight beams skinned the darkness left and right. Thomas couldn't take his eyes off the artifact. "I hear them, they're saying." "Who?" "God damn it, who's saying what?" "Talk to me, Tommy, what's going on?" Agent Smith wasted no time. It was clear that danger was his second nature. In the blink of an eye his gun was drawn and at the ready. He quickly reached for his specialized communication device. With trembling hands, he pressed the device to his ear, hoping for some form of contact. But all he heard was static and crackling on the other end. Deep in the frequency he could hear a hum. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence. The soldiers turned their attention upward, their eyes widening with terror. This time, they bore witness to the unthinkable. A soldier was snatched up from the ground, his body disappearing into the unfathomable darkness above. The cavernous chamber seemed to consume him, leaving only the echoes of his final cries. Edward's heart pounded in his chest as he watched in horror, Thomas's hand still firmly planted on the stone disc. And then, as if in response to the gruesome spectacle, scraps of clothing, boots, and blood began to rain down from the abyss above. Drops of crimson splattered onto the stone carvings that adorned the cavern floor. One drop, however, landed directly upon a peculiar symbol carved into the stone, a symbol that seemed to thirst for the essence of life. The blood was drawn toward it, as if guided by some unseen force, and was swiftly absorbed into the intricate grooves. The symbol awakened, its ancient power rekindled. Sending a malignant wave of power throughout the entire cavern, the earth quivered in response. A low, guttural bass emerged from the heart of the disc, growing louder and more intense with each passing second. Thomas's hand, still resting on the surface, trembled as the disc beneath it began to emit an ominous glow. The light emanated from the engravings, coursing through the grooves and lines, as if the very essence of the artifact was awakening. The cave walls groaned in protest, as small pebbles began to shower from the ceiling. Feeling a surge of fear at the realization, Edward hastily tried to remove Thomas's hand from the disc. In that instant, a resounding crack echoed through the chamber, sending shockwaves through the air. The stone disc, burdened by the dark power it had harnessed, cracked down the middle, revealing an ominous void within. Edward, distracted by the commotion, turned back to see Thomas was gone. Either by instinct or out of fear, he held his hand in front of his face, blocking the void. The soldier closest to him wasn't that smart nor lucky. Once the man's eyes locked onto the void, there was no breaking the connection, and in his zombified state he lumbered forward to the rift. A white mist bellowed out from the nostrils and mouth, funneling into the crack. The man's body crashed to the ground in a heap. Edward screamed and ran for Agent Smith, whose calm demeanor slipped into panic, watching his men disappear and die around him. He took hold of the screaming Edward, shaking them by his shoulders. He said, "Come on, we gotta get out of here now. I knew this was a suicide mission when they sent me out here." Gripping him by the collar, he dragged him back towards the submersible. Their only relief was seeing it bobbing in the waves. "Malcolm, come." Smith was cut off by the fading scream of the soldier. Edward and Smith ran for the submersible the entire time, looking for any sign of Thomas. Edward's legs burnt with the effort, and every step they threatened to give out. The screams of the dying soldier doubled his effort. A splash of blood painted the cave's entrance as they made it within feet of the sub. "Get it, now." Smith held the door, waving the panicked researcher inside. The cab wasn't even fully pressurized before they began their retreat. Looking back one more time, they saw Thomas burst from the darkness as if he was born from it. Edward asked for Smith to stop, but it was too late. The person who was Thomas was no longer there. His friend, his colleague and partner, stopped mid-run, convulsing. Edward's last image of Thomas before sinking below the surface. Thomas's face split down the center and opened like a blooming flower. Then Ocean, Smith was frantically trying to hail the ship on comms. Agent Smith, with his iron jaw set in a determined grimace, maneuvered the submersible with a precision that belied the adrenaline coursing through his veins. His hands, slick with sweat, gripped the controls tightly as he navigated through the collapsing labyrinth of the subterranean facility. Beside him, Edward's gaze was glued to the portholes, each violent tremor sending a fresh wave of dread through him. He saw huge chunks of the structure crumble, enveloping the waters in a cloud of detritus. The floodlights of the submersible danced through the murk. A low bass note reverberated inside the cab. "We're almost there," Smith grunted, his focus never wavering from the navigation panel. Finally, with a relieved sigh, Smith hailed their vessel. "Valkyrie, this is Agent Smith. Request immediate extraction. We are surfacing now." The response was immediate. "Copy that, Agent Smith. Preparing to hoist." They broke through the surface, the dark ocean giving way to an even darker night. A massive crane arm swung into view, and the submersible was swiftly hoisted onto the deck of the vessel, water cascading off its sleek sides. Without a word, Smith was gone, striding purposefully into the bowels of the ship, leaving Edward alone on the deck. His body shivered uncontrollably, his mind still reeling from the sight of his colleague's gruesome fate. The image of his friend's face splitting open, tendrils spilling out like some nightmarish creature, was seared into his memory. Before Edward could even begin to process, the ship lurched violently, the ocean convulsing as if in agony. Waves emanated from a central point, growing larger and more ferocious by the second. Ignoring Smith's orders, the captain gunned the engine, the ship surging forward in a desperate bid to escape. And then, from the maelstrom, a colossal form began to rise. An inky silhouette that dwarfed their ship, water cascading off its enormous surface. The sight of it was enough to freeze the blood in Edward's veins. Its sheer size and the unknown nature of it was akin to bearing witness to a malevolent god. Under the illumination of a lightning strike, he can make out the dragon wings spreading against the night sky. Flailing tendrils dancing off its face, it was as wide as a city skyline. Thud, 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 large impacts shook the vessel. One by one, serpent men began to spill onto the deck. Human torsos grafted onto serpentine bodies, their heads elongated and reptilian. Their arrival was met with a barrage of gunfire from the shell-shocked soldiers. Bullets tore into the invaders, but they kept coming, their scales absorbing most of the rounds. They were upon the soldiers in seconds, their serpent bodies coiling and uncoiling with deadly precision, strangling the life from victims or injecting deadly poison to course through their veins. Edward, fueled by sheer terror, raced for the bowels of the ship. He found Agent Smith in the armory, loading his assault rifle with practiced movements. "I don't think that's going to work," Edward stammered, his eyes wide with terror. Smith simply slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle, his face a mask of unreadable stoicness. "We're about to find out." They emerged back onto the deck to a scene of carnage. The last two soldiers were fighting a desperate, losing battle against the horde of serpent men. Smith opened fire, his rifle barking out death in short, controlled bursts. Edward clapped his hands over his ears, the gunfire echoing painfully in the confined space. And then, the ship was plunged into darkness. Edward looked up, confused. The stars and moon had been blotted out, replaced by a shadowy form of such magnitude that it dwarfed everything else. For a second, he was dumbstruck, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. As his mind raced to make sense of the scene, a memory surfaced. A book he had read as a youth for a lark, a book dismissed as a joke, a book called the Necronomicon. A name rose unbidden to his lips, a name that carried with it the weight of an ancient horror. Cthulhu. The last thing he saw was a writhing mass of tentacles, reaching out from the monstrous figure looming over the ship. Then an enormous maw opened, a void of utter darkness that promised nothing but oblivion. It was a sinkhole in the sky, a pit into which the world seemed to be falling. As the abyss yawned wide, Edward's scream was swallowed by the night.